Hello, my name's Aaron. I'm a scientist. Who else is a scientist here? Hello, scientists. Yeah, I'm just going to give it a little bit of an overview, and then we'll get going into the talk. So, thank you all very much for being here. I'm going to talk a bit about the climate and ecological emergency. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to be reading from my notes today. And then I'm going to say a bit about Extinction Rebellion, of which I'm a member, and what we're doing about the climate and ecological emergency, and why it's so important. That will take about half an hour or so, and then there'll be time for questions, and we'll explain some of the ways that you could support or get involved. And then after that, we're also going to have a couple of testimonials from some of the other members of the organisation, just so you can see the kind of roles and the kind of things that they do within the movement. What we're going to talk about is pretty heavy, and I'm really grateful for you all being here and taking the time to engage with this on a sunny day when there's a lot of festival going on around us. And I think to make some time for something quite serious and to kind of really let that in is not an easy thing. So thank you for doing that. And as I'm sure you're aware, it's a really serious issue, and it hasn't had its full attention that it needs. And that's often for understandable reasons, but we do really need to talk about this. And I'd like to start by asking you to introduce yourselves to someone nearby that you don't know, and just maybe explain why you've come to the event. What was the motivation for being here in the first place? And maybe some of the things that you're worried about. And I'll give you 3 minutes for doing that whilst I just finish getting ready, and then we'll start, okay? Okay, great. Okay, so as I said, it's going to take about half an hour, and then we're going to have Q&A. So last November, during the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, myself and about 20 other scientists walked out across a busy bridge, and we chained ourselves to one another to block road traffic. After a few hours, stood peacefully in the freezing rain, bringing the city's traffic to a standstill, we were arrested one by one and taken into police custody. The next day, we were in most of the Scottish newspapers. What would lead me, an Earth system scientist by training, and normally an utterly law-abiding person, to do such a thing? So as I said, my name's Dr. Aaron Thierry. I'm an ecologist by training. I did a PhD in ecology, and then I went on and did a postdoc. And then I've actually also been really involved in various different environmental campaign groups. And most recently, I've kind of gone into researching climate communications and how we help explain the severity of the climate crisis, as I'm trying to do today. My research focused on environmental change, and it had led me to the Arctic as part of an interdisciplinary team examining the effect that increasingly frequent and severe wildfires are having on the carbon stores in the Arctic North. In particular, I wanted to know how the permafrost, which is the frozen soils, was responding to these fires. The Arctic is warming at roughly 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet, and that rate of change puts the Arctic ecosystems and its communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. I was particularly interested in the moss layer at the top of the soils, because in the far north, you kind of get these blankets of moss growing over the soil that can be several inches thick. And it acts as like an insulating blanket that keeps the permafrost cold throughout the summer. And that then keeps it stable. But when the fires come along, they can burn through this moss layer, and they're becoming very frequent and much more intense, so they're burning much more of the moss. And that leaves then a scorched, dark surface without the insulation behind, and that then can lead to additional heat going into the soils, and that can start thawing out the permafrost. And you can get slumping, that forms lakes and pools. Those produce anaerobic environments that bacteria can break down the organic matter in those soils to release CO2 and methane back into the atmosphere and accelerate the climate change process. So that's why it was so important that what we were doing was to try and understand and quantify those kind of feedbacks, which are really particular to the ecology of those ecosystems. Whilst on fieldwork, I met a volunteer firefighter, a member of the First Nations communities that lived there, and he was exhausted. He explained to me that in the past a few years, these fires, which used to be a rare occurrence, and he might have only spent like a few days a summer fighting fires, but that summer he'd been away from home for months, fighting blaze after blaze. The forest was so hot and dry that the fires were erupting everywhere. He went on to tell me that this was having huge implications, this warming, for his community. So traditionally, they would go out onto the frozen lakes in the winter and they would fish. But because of the warming that's happening, the ice is freezing later and later in the autumn, and it's melting earlier and earlier in the spring, and it's not having time to thicken enough for them to go safely out onto the ice to fish and to support themselves as they have done for millennia. Not only that, but he was telling me that summer the water level in the lake had dropped so much that they weren't able to power the hydroelectric dam that powered the whole city's energy supply. This was the only city for miles around. So what they had to do instead was ship up lorry after lorry of diesel from the Alberta tar sands, hundreds of miles away, all the way to the far north, in order to burn them in diesel generators, which was then having really adverse effects on the air quality in the city. But it wasn't just the generators that were affecting the city, it was the wildfire smoke itself, which was noxious and everywhere. Just after I left, the whole city almost had to be evacuated because the fire was encroaching that much on the settlement. My colleagues, who were still supposed to be doing field work, were told that they couldn't leave their homes where they were staying and had to stay indoors for a week because it was too dangerous to go out into the field. And not only that, but they couldn't open the windows to their apartments because the air quality was so bad that they couldn't breathe it. The Arctic Circle is burning, and what I saw in the far north terrified me. My mum was actually an environmental science teacher, so I grew up in a household highly aware from a young age of the changes that fossil fuel burning is having on the planet. But despite that, it took me a long time to accept that the people in power are simply not taking this issue seriously. I've been an active member of Friends of the Earth. I was the co-chair of the Sheffield Climate Alliance. I've written and marched, voted and petitioned, and I've changed my lifestyle and spending habits, and all the time I've watched emissions go up and up for every year of my life. I look at my nieces and my nephews who will grow up over the next couple of decades, and in this time they'll go through the incredible process of coming to know the world and themselves in it. They will imagine their future, who they'll fall in love with, what job they'll have, where they'll live, as the world falls apart around them. You're probably here because you've seen the headlines, and you might have read some of the reports. Millions of other people have read those same headlines, and now almost everyone knows that the climate crisis is real and that it is scary. But for most people are not here, right? So most people probably didn't read, for example, the United Nations' most recent report, which said we have a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. That's a direct quote. Let's just think about that, what that means for a second, right? All the evidence has been put together and analysed, and the conclusion is that we are very quickly running out of time. A closing window of opportunity is talking about a place that we can't come back from. It's talking about passing tipping points, like the loss of ice in the north and south poles that reflect the sun's heat, or the loss of rainforests that absorb carbon, or the taiga forest that I studied in the Arctic. And the worst case scenarios are not in hundreds or thousands of years, but this century. They're in the lifetimes of many of us, in my nephew and niece's lifetimes. You're probably here because you know that. Even if we stopped burning fossil fuels tomorrow, we would still feel the effects of existing emissions for decades to come, as the climate change we have already caused is essentially irreversible. Maybe, like me, you're worried that the way politicians and voices in the media talk about this issue, if they talk about it at all, does not fit with the science. Our government has committed to net zero by 2050. That really worries me, because politicians and the public knew about this problem since 30 years ago, and they agreed then that greenhouse gas emissions really had to come down and soon. But since then, since we all knew what had to be done, cumulative global emissions have more than doubled. Concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere keep rising exponentially. So where are we now, and where are we going? We could start with what happened this spring in India and Pakistan, where temperatures were over 49 degrees Celsius. You think this is hot? Imagine 49 degrees. Those lucky enough to have air conditioning were protected for a while, but the AC machines quickly started to break down in the heat as the electric grid browned out. People put wet towels over babies, the elderly, and the most vulnerable. But when water ran out, they were faced with the choice of walking in almost 50-degree heat or staying at home and hoping that the temperature would come down. When heat and humidity reach a certain point, we are no longer able to regulate the temperature of our bodies, and people simply die. Do you remember the heat wave in North America last summer? In a small town called Lytton in Canada, not too far from where my research sites were, the average July daytime temperature there is normally 21 degrees Celsius, similar to here in the UK. Last July, it was 49.6 degrees Celsius, and the next day, the town was literally burned to the ground. One of the challenges we face in being able to talk about this stuff in a way that captures how serious it is that in the last couple of 100 years, humans have warmed the planet by 1.2 degrees Celsius. It sounds so insignificant. Yet, we have now all seen the images of fields either flooded or baked dry as temperatures and rainfall records are smashed repeatedly all around the world. We've seen videos of people trying to escape raging fires or waiting to be rescued from the roofs of their homes. Maybe you saw a video from Australia during a heat wave a couple of summers ago showing thousands of fruit bats simply dropping dead from the trees because of the heat. Yet we've had the solutions for decades. Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House in 1979, but they didn't stay there long. It seems like we've been on the edge of a green revolution for years. So why hasn't it happened yet? Why was COP26, the climate conference in Glasgow last year, the 26th failed attempt to sort this out? Alok Sharma, the conference's host and our government's representative, rounded up the conference fighting back tears. He knew it was nowhere near enough. It's so easy to set targets and to talk about what we might do in the future. As you probably know, governments around the world set targets to protect the natural world and halt biodiversity loss back in 2010. None of those targets have been met. Not a single one. We've all heard about the targets set for net zero by 2050, even from some of the big fossil fuel companies. Net zero sounds good, doesn't it? But then you read that the 12 biggest oil companies are going to spend $103 million every single day for the rest of the decade, drilling for new oil and gas. We're talking about roughly $1 trillion in total. $1 trillion. As things stand, governments look set to allow double the production of fossil fuels in 2030 as would be consistent with our internationally agreed climate targets. And they continue to license new fossil fuel projects, including here in the UK in the North Sea, the new Jackdaw gas field. They're talking about the Cambo gas oil field. There's just been approval of a new oil field in Surrey. You know, this is our government who call themselves climate leaders. Carbon that simply has to stay in the ground if we're to keep our climate targets. They cannot resist. Did you hear that the boss of BP recently described the company as a cash machine? He said that at a time when ordinary people can't afford their energy bills and the UN is talking about code red for humanity. Code red for humanity. If governments around the world don't take immediate and drastic action, we now know what we should expect. We know what the evidence is telling us, right? We can see what is already happening, devastating effects on the incredible wildlife that we still have. Homes and property becoming uninsurable, widespread crop failures leading to food shortages, flooded landfill sites releasing toxic waste, and the constant unpredictability as wildfires, drought, and torrential rains become everyday occurrences. The kind of wildfires that we see in California right now, they're coming to the south of England in 2050. Globally, we should expect the forced displacement of coastal populations and vast areas of the planet becoming literally uninhabitable. Recent work suggests that as soon as just 5 decades from now, 3 billion people could be living in areas too hot for humans to tolerate, essentially the entire tropics. It's a lot to take in. And I just want to really say thank you again for being here and engaging with the reality of where we are. It's something I've been having to try and do for years now, and it never sits easy. It's just really horrendous. So why is nothing changing? Well, it's a huge and complicated challenge, and it's difficult to even hold it in our minds, let alone work out what we as individuals should do about it. Millions of people have seen the headlines and feel worried that the government isn't doing enough. Everybody wants a planet we can live on. But what, as individuals, can we do? It seems like exactly the kind of issue that government or some other powerful organization should be dealing with. But the millions that fossil fuel corporations spend on lobbying the government result in billions in tax relief and subsidies. And just as fossil fuel corporations will always prioritize profits, politicians seem to focus on winning the next election. Now we need real leadership, which means being honest about how bad the situation is and what the response needs to look like. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world with amazing and terrible consequences, and it started here. Now we need to lead the world into a green revolution. The only question is whether or not it will happen in time. Investment in green jobs and an economy that has a chance of coping with what's coming is so obviously what's needed. But there are still some big political and economic barriers. Our goal is to put enough pressure on the government for it to overcome those barriers. We've been told by people inside the government and parliament, as well as big corporations, that they know what needs to happen, and they're desperate for that pressure because they don't know how to do it from the inside. From the start, Extinction Rebellion has been focused on reality, honestly acknowledging how bad things are, and then working out what to do about it. By the time I joined Extinction Rebellion, I was feeling frustrated and depressed. I had this terrible feeling that the people in power are locked into business as usual, and traditional methods of campaigning were never going to work in time. And then I heard about this group who were trying something different. It sounded scary, but interesting, so I found out more. Since then, I've organized actions, I've been arrested, I've worked with other scientists on public outreach and education campaigns, and helped train and organize other people to do actions, and I've met incredible people, and I've seen what we can do together. Teachers, engineers, nurses, farmers, artists, parents and grandparents, working together and using their shared strength. I'm still worried that I might look back at this moment and think, I really should have done more. But when I got involved with XR, I found people who felt the same. And for the first time, I thought, maybe, just maybe, this is going to be enough. And I see things changing. More and more people get it. The climate crisis is right up there at the top of people's concerns, and XR has been a big part of getting that message out there. This doesn't mean the job is done. because we're still not seeing the actual changes in policies that we need to bring emissions down and protect the natural world. So our objective has changed. It's not simply about sounding the alarm anymore. Now it's about making real change happen in the limited time that we have left. We've been able to communicate the urgency of the crisis in a way that other, more traditional campaigning groups have not, and we've achieved this through disruptive civil disobedience. Politicians have to constantly say what they think people want to hear. They're desperate to be popular, even if that means being dishonest. We don't have that problem. Whatever people think of us, the vast majority agree with our message, and that's all we need. A UN climate scientist was recently on the radio saying that it had felt for decades like she was banging on a locked door trying to get this message out there. She said that in the last few years, that door had opened, and she referenced Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes movement as being critical in making this happen. And I agree. In 2019, we took to the streets of London for nearly 2 weeks with a few thousand people, and as a direct result, Parliament debated and then declared a climate emergency. What we did had never been done before. It pushed climate into the headlines and woke people up to the urgency of the situation. And now, almost everybody acknowledges the problem and believes that action is necessary. But most people still don't know how bad things are or what needs to happen to avoid the worst effects. The media often make it sound like action on the climate is expensive and an unpleasant prospect, when in fact, many of the solutions are positive things like that would be good for everyone. Less pollution, improved health, more trees and wild spaces, clean rivers, a fairer and sustainable economy, and most importantly, a planet we can live on. We're already feeling the costs of inaction through massive energy price rises, and as we see happening now, those costs are felt by ordinary people first and hardest, while the fossil fuel corporations make obscene profits. A fairer and safer, sustainable future is still possible, but as we have been told by the UN, our window of opportunity is rapidly closing. So we're facing a huge challenge. We know that people in positions of power are failing to do what needs to be done. And we know that we have incredible strength when we work together and use imaginative and impactful tactics that can't be ignored. Non-violent direct action is what we do. This can take many forms, and it absolutely doesn't just mean arrestable actions. Some people are in a position to be arrested or even go to prison, and this can be a very effective tactic, but the majority of the people involved in XR are unable to risk arrest, and their work is just as important. We've put a huge amount of time into researching similar movements to see what is most likely to work in the short amount of time that we have left. The evidence shows that a small but significant proportion of the population needs to be engaged. Nobody knows exactly how many people, and of course it depends on what they do. But the more people who get involved, the more options we have, and the more power we have to put pressure on the government. This pressure must be sustained over time, and it must be widespread throughout society and from different groups within society. With just small numbers of people, the actions need to have a really big impact. When very large numbers are involved, hundreds of thousands or even millions, then each individual needs to do far less. If 50 people take part in actions that are highly disruptive to the public or the economy, they might face some time on remand or in prison. This gets lots of media attention and therefore puts pressure on the government to respond, but if a few thousand people sit on the road and refuse to move until they're arrested, this also has a massive effect, which is exactly how we got Parliament to do what was obvious and declare a climate and ecological emergency in 2019. MPs aren't stupid. They knew then how bad things look. They just needed a little nudge to come out and admit it. We did that with less than 10,000 people. Imagine what we could do with 100,000 people. It would be clear to everyone that we are a mass movement of ordinary people making our voices heard. This is how we win. Sustained, coordinated pressure on the government from all angles. In April 2019, we got our first big win when the UK Parliament declared a climate and ecological emergency. Our next win will be our immediate demand, which is to end all new fossil fuel investments and subsidies. This is obviously necessary and totally doable. It would require the government to get its act together and to come up with an ambitious strategy on renewables, and it would trigger a response from business and speed up investment in secure, sustainable energy alternatives that don't start wars or leave people struggling to pay their bills while corporations make vast profits. Either we kill the fossil fuel economy or it kills us. Everyone knows this is where we need to go. The only question is, will we do it in time? The corporations and billionaires profiting from business as usual are putting pressure on governments to slow down the transition. So we need to apply more pressure to speed it up. Just like with the climate, there are social tipping points, and they happen when a critical mass of committed people take action together. Millions of people know that we need to make big changes, and fast. So we need to get them involved in making it happen. That's why we're mobilizing across the country. We're going to start by getting 100,000 people on the streets and getting the government to take meaningful action to stop investment and public funding for new fossil fuel extraction. This will be the invitation for millions more to step up. But we need your help to build that movement. So get involved in your local group, connect with other organizations, and if you feel able, train and take part in our actions. We've already done hundreds of these talks, and we're going to do hundreds more every month across the country. But we need your help to make sure those talks happen, that they're well attended, and they get people actively engaged. Whether or not you have an hour or two a week, or you're ready to do this full time, we need you. We really need you. We don't have all the answers, and I'm afraid no guarantees. We welcome criticism of our plan, and if you have ideas about what we could do better, then please get involved and help us make them happen. We all want a livable planet. Without that, we've got nothing. So we have to work backwards from that shared goal. We're ordinary people who've come together because we believe that together we can do something extraordinary. Being part of this effort is often challenging, sometimes frustrating, and sometimes it's scary. But every single person I've met or worked with in XR shares a few things. They care, they are kind, and they have the courage of their convictions. I've never been so consistently amazed and inspired by people. Now we'll try to answer any questions that you have and explain some of the ways that you can get involved. But first, let's just remember that today, right now, across the world, species are going extinct, forests are going up in smoke, farmers are staring at their dying crops, and families are worried about how they'll heat their homes and feed their children. At the same time, there are millions of people in this country, like you, who know this and wish that they could do something about it. We need to knock on their doors and invite them to join us. This is our fight. We know what the solutions are, we just need to make them happen. Whatever time and energy that you have could make a huge difference. So thank you again for your time and your attention. It will be an honor to stand alongside you.